What we're going to be discussing today is the role of the private person in tackling green offences. And it's my hope that by the end of this presentation, I will have illustrated that you don't have to be a law enforcement official or part of private security or an owner of large tracts of land to make a positive contribution in tackling green offences in South Africa. And what we mean by green offences will be illustrated through this presentation. A brief overview of the presentation itself. What we're going to do is, at a very high level and very quickly, go through the legal framework regulating species of fauna and flora. By that I mean animals and plants, unpacking the law to determine what green offences are, what permit requirements exist for these species, and what offences one can commit in terms of these species. And after that, to show that there's light at the end of the tunnel, we will consider what the ordinary South African can do about green offences. Now, I have tried to keep distressing photos to a minimum. Unfortunately, the next slide is a bit distressing in nature, so apologies in advance. But when we think about green offences, this is commonly what we think about. We think about the poaching of rhino, we think about the poaching of elephant, and we think about the smuggling of parts from these animals, being elephant ivory and rhino horn. What we don't think about is the smuggling of pets, wildlife pets, being indigenous birds, reptiles or snakes. We don't think about supporting facilities that don't have the correct permits for their operations. We don't think about the plants in our gardens and whether those plants enter trade legally and what permit requirements exist for these plants. So we do tend to take quite a narrow, rather blinkered approach to what green offences are. And I'm hoping to illustrate that this is far broader than just the poaching of megafauna across Africa. What you won't find if you look at our legislation is a definition of green offence or wildlife crime. But that doesn't mean that there's not a commonly accepted definition that we apply. And that's really that green offences is any offence that harms or negatively affects or has the potential to harm or negatively affect the protection and conservation of the environment and the ecological sustainable use of the environment. What we're going to spend the next couple of slides going through is the legal framework, specifically how we regulate fauna and flora in South Africa. And I have tried to make it as interesting and engaging for people that maybe don't find the law as exciting as I do. But the first part of any legal assessment is what are the constitutional provisions. And we are incredibly fortunate in South Africa to have dedicated environmental rights included in our constitution. And this is that everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health and well-being, and everyone has the right to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations through reasonable legislative and other measures that do one of three things: promote, and the one that's most important for our purposes today is the promotion of conservation. I'd now like to draw your attention to the National Environmental Management Act, commonly called NEMA. And what NEMA does is it brings the rights contained in Section 24 into a more concrete reality. The Constitution will tell us that we have the right to have the environment protected, and NEMA really unpacks how we protect the environment. What authorizations do we need? What agencies are created to ensure that environmental crimes are investigated? And how do we approach the courts to achieve this, this environmental protection? But NEMA is, by its nature, a framework act. And by that, I mean it at a very high level regulates and provides governance for the environment in South Africa, but it doesn't go into specific information or detail on the regulation of components of the environment, be that biodiversity, marine living resources, protected areas, air quality, and these are all examples of aspects of the environment. What NEMA does is it leaves that regulation to its specific environmental management acts. And the specific Environmental Management Act that's most important for our purposes today is the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act, commonly referred to as Nimba. Now, NEMA can be regarded as our most important piece of biodiversity legislation because for the first time when it came into effect in 2004, we had a national approach to the regulation of biodiversity, where previously biodiversity was regulated by the provinces, with each province taking its own approach. What Nimba does for our purposes today is it provides us with a legal foundation supported by its regulations to enforce CITES, which is an international agreement regulating trade. and to regulate activities in respect of certain species. Before we go any further into the provisions of Nimba itself, I would like to draw your attention to two definitions that are quite important for the remainder of the presentation. And this is, the first is species, and species are defined in Nimba as a kind of animal, plant, or other organism that does not normally interbreed with individuals of another kind and includes subspecies. And the second definition is that of specimen, being any living or dead animal or plant or other organism, any part of that that's capable of propagation or reproduction, any derivative of an animal, plant, or other organism, or any goods containing a derivative or which appear from the packaging or labeling to contain a derivative. So if we look at the pictures that are illustrated on the slide at the moment, the first line is that of species. A pangolin, there's a very young Encephalotus horridus, which is one of our indigenous cycads, and there's an elephant calf. While these are species, they're also included in the definition of specimen. The bottom row are specimens. You have ivory there, bits of rhino horn, and then various parts of various animals. So they would all be included in the definition of specimen. Now, how we regulate fauna and flora in South Africa, one of the primary methods, is by the listing of species in need of protection or regulation, and then providing control measures to these species. And I've illustrated three lists here that are very important in the regulation of species in South Africa. Unfortunately, due to time, we're only going to be focusing on the first list, and that is the list of critically endangered, vulnerable, or protected species that was published in 2007. Now, this list is commonly known as the TOPS list, TOPS being an acronym for threatened or protected species, not to be confused with the TOPS bottle store. The legal foundation for this list, for the TOPS list, is section 56.1 of Nimba, where provision is made for the listing of species that are threatened or in need of protection, and that list will be divided into one of four categories. The first is critically endangered. These are species, the indigenous species, which are facing an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild in the immediate future. The second category is endangered species, and these are indigenous species facing a high risk of extinction in the wild in the near future, although they are not critically endangered. The third is vulnerable species, being any indigenous species facing an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild in the medium-term future, although they are not critically endangered or endangered. And the final category is protected species, and these are any species that are of such a high conservation value or national importance that they require regulation in order to ensure that the species is managed in an ecologically suitable manner. Now, the reason the TOPS list is so important from a green offence perspective is because of this general rule. And if you only take one thing out of this presentation, please let it be this rule. The rule is that no person may undertake a restricted activity involving any specimen listed or of a species listed in the TOPS list without a permit issued in terms of Chapter 7 of Nimba. Now, you might be questioning then, what is a restricted activity? And what I have illustrated here is a copy and paste of the definition of restricted activity taken from Nimba. And you can see how incredibly comprehensive this definition is. To use the words of an excellent prosecutor who prosecutes wildlife crimes quite regularly, he summarized it for me saying that a restricted activity is anything short of looking at a top species. And it was a rule of thumb that I've applied quite regularly since then. So we understand we need a permit to undertake restricted activities for TOPS listed species. What we're going to look at now are some rules around the permits themselves. You can apply for permits in any of the 9 provinces at designated offices. I will share my email address at the end of this presentation, and you are more than welcome to email me for contact information for these offices. But very importantly, you can only undertake the activities that are listed on your permit. So if you have a permit, for example, to possess a specimen, but you want to breed or sell that specimen, you would have to amend your permit or alternatively apply for a new one. And you also have to comply with the permit conditions attached to the permit, and these are generally on the reverse of the first page. So looking very briefly at the example of the permit that I've got up on the screen, if you take a look at the middle of the permit, you'll see the activities that the EWT was able to conduct. These are possession, catching, euthanizing, gathering, collecting, transporting, conveying, receiving, gathering, and hunting. If you look at the bottom of the permit, you'll see the period of validity. This permit was valid for a year between October 2013 and October 2014. And if you look at the top of the permit, you'll see the permit holder's information, as well as the information of the issuing authority, which in this case was GDOD, being the Gauteng Conservation Authority. Now, you would commit an offence in terms of a top species if you act in violation of your permit, or you don't have a permit but are undertaking restricted activities. And if you're found guilty of these offences, your penalties at the maximum can be 10 years imprisonment, a fine not exceeding 10 million rand, or both. What we're going to look at now is what the ordinary South African can do to help combat green offences. And the first solution or opportunity, I suppose, is to be part of the solution and not the problem. Ensure that you yourself are not contributing to wildlife crimes. And the first part of that is knowing, and this presentation goes a long way to do that. Understand the rules and requirements that are expected of you and comply with them. And if you don't know, please ask. As I mentioned earlier, I will share my contact information at the end of this presentation, and you're more than welcome to email me any questions you might have about compliance with the regulations and the legislation itself. And then the last is to report. And I've got the DA, and apologies, it's now the Department of Environment, Forest and Fisheries reporting hotline. Please do share information that you might have or any suspicions that you might have to that hotline. The second opportunity is to help us raise awareness. So where we asked you in the beginning, in the previous slide, to be part of the solution, here we're asking you to be an ambassador. What we're not doing here is we're not asking you to undertake extensive awareness raising campaigns or initiatives, but to simply share the information that we provide. I'd like to just take a bit of time to discuss an example here, which really illustrates the power of the South African braai. When I joined the Endangered Wildlife Trust, I'd never heard of Cycads before, despite the fact that South Africa's got 37 indigenous species. And despite the severe threat that these species are under due to illegal trade and extensive poaching within South Africa. From the beginning, I think it was very much linked to my previous manager, Adam Perez, and his passion for Cycads. But I slowly developed a passion for Cycads, and we started undertaking a lot of work around conservation of Cycads in South Africa. And when I went to braais with friends or family, and they would ask me what I was doing, I'd tell them all about Cycads. And that led to follow-up questions where friends and family would then ask me if they needed permits and how they got permits. And they then shared that information with their friends and family circles. And so the message trickles down. And that is the power of the South African braai. And it's an excellent tool to use to raise awareness. So please do take those opportunities and share the information that we share. The next opportunity is to support the work of law enforcement and NGOs. And this is tied very closely to the first opportunity, which is being part of the solution and reporting suspicions and crimes that you may see or be aware of, because law enforcement need that information to conduct their operations. So please do report crimes and help law enforcement in the combating of green offences. And in terms of supporting NGOs, this doesn't just necessarily need to be financial support. Although financial support is greatly appreciated and allows us to do the work that we do and achieve the results that we achieve, it's not the only way that people can support our work. Out-of-the-box thinking, sharing new information, novel approaches, current research, sharing any of that with an NGO is always greatly appreciated and allows us to respond to trends and brainstorm and expand our own operations. And then lastly, in terms of specific support, because of the content of this presentation, I'd also like to highlight supporting the Endangered Wildlife Trust in achieving justice for green offences. And I'd like to take the opportunity here to really applaud the NPA for the work that they do. they work under very difficult situations and with very limited capacity. And the prosecutors that are prosecuting green offences have had amazing successes. So this is in no way a snub to that work, but it's in recognition that green offences are a wicked problem. And to combat wicked problems, you need to be very dynamic in your approach. So what we'd like to do quickly is highlight 2 additional approaches that one can take to achieve justice for wildlife offences or green offences. And these are exploring private prosecution and restorative justice processes. So with private prosecution, this is a provision that's included in Section 33 of NEMA, which allows for any person to initiate a private prosecution in respect of any breach or threatened breach of a prescribed duty, provided such a person acts in the public interest or in the interest of protection of the environment. And restorative justice is an approach to justice that aims to involve the parties to a dispute, and others affected by the harm, such as the victim and the offender, in collectively identifying harms, needs, and obligations through the accepting of responsibilities, making restitution, and taking measures to prevent the reoccurrence of the incident. And the EWT is currently working on exploring both of these opportunities. And if you are interested in these specifically, I would ask you to please contact me. And with that, it brings our presentation to a close. And we'll now open the Q&A section of this presentation. And as discussed earlier, here is my email address. So thank you very much for joining. The first one comes from Miranda, based in Australia. Thank you very much for joining us. She mentions that we wish we had more prosecutions for illegal trade and vegetation removal. And it is something, and this is why we're exploring other avenues of justice as well, so that we're not just reliant on formal criminal justice, but we need to be quite dynamic in our approaches to achieving justice and whatever that might look like for the cases specifically. So Miranda, if you'd like to contact me, I'm very, very happy to share some successes that our prosecutors have had, just to showcase their work, and then also where our research and our work is currently taking us for private prosecutions and restorative justice. Anthony, the question is that he's based in the Crocodile River Reserve, and you guys have had a problem with wood cutting of indigenous trees and plant theft. Absolutely. So the question is, does this fall under a green crime? And it absolutely does. Unfortunately, with the time that we had here, we weren't able to showcase all of the legislation and the various lists. For indigenous trees, we've got the Forestry Act, and it's currently regulated. Now the department is moving to the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. It was previously with the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. But Anthony, I'm going to ask you to please contact me directly, and I'm going to put you in touch with enforcement officials that work in the forestry section specifically, who can maybe assist you in more detail. Andreas said the prosecution aspect is problematic. The magistrate courts are unable to enforce our laws, and how can this be addressed? And Anthony, this is exactly why we're looking at alternative or complementary solutions to formal prosecution. I think we need to be mindful in South Africa that we have extremely high crime rates, and our courts are backlogged, if we're very honest about it. So it's not just wildlife crimes or environmental crimes that our courts are trying to process, but a wide range of interpersonal crimes, murders, high theft, etc. And it's for this reason, again, that we are looking at complementary and other avenues that we can try and achieve justice for wildlife crimes. Sorry, and that's why I'd raise private prosecution and restorative justice. So Andres, if you're looking for a little bit more information on that, I would ask that you also please contact me directly. How can you breach issues? One may encounter people using listed plants for traditional use. And this is an incredibly interesting question, and it brings a dynamic of cultural use that does add a layer to trying to address, at least regulate these matters. It's a project that the Endangered Wildlife Trust is going to be specifically looking at in the near future. We're in the process of finalizing it. But what I would like to say is that although we have a recognition in our constitution of cultural practices, it doesn't supersede other environmental rights. So what we need to try and do is find a balance between cultural use or traditional use and protection of the environment. And we do that through regulation. So you'll find that although we're asking for permits, there are no prohibitions for using species. One would just need to apply for permits to process and undertake traditional practices. But maybe, Christine, if you wouldn't mind also just contacting me directly, I'd love to put you in touch with our program manager for our People and Conservation program. And I know she's been specifically looking at this topic in great detail. I've got a question from Rhiannon, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. The question is, how does one decide which species fall under Nimba and what is the criteria? And that's an excellent question. You would have noted that the list that I mentioned came through in 2017. What Nimba requires is for that list to be updated every 5 years. And unfortunately, we've not seen those updates. But what should take place for those updates is we would look at the threats that the species face. And these are not just crime-related threats, or at least poaching or illegal harvesting, but we're also looking at habitat destruction. And we would use scientific information to assess the threats that the species are facing in the wild, and based on those threats, decide whether they should be critically endangered, vulnerable, or protected. Now, what you might have noticed is that we had a pangolin, for example, that is listed, my apologies. We had pangolin, for example, that's listed as a vulnerable species, but given the escalation in wildlife crimes involving pangolin, listed as a higher category on the list itself, critically endangered perhaps, or even endangered. Kathy asked, what happens if the green offence is not a threatened species? I have a neighbour who has vervet monkeys in a cage on my fence line. KZN Wildlife has confirmed that there is no permit for these monkeys. It's also not a sanctuary and all the monkeys are sterilised. Kathy, what we weren't able to discuss today is the provincial regulations. So although we focused on the threatened or protected species list, all the provinces have provincial conservation legislation that affords a wider protection to more species. If you could, Kathy, please can you contact me directly? I would like to look into this matter in more detail with you. Marion has asked, what about coastal resources like abalone? Poachers do what they like there, and it's terrifying in some areas to the extent that one cannot go for a walk on the beach. So here's Marion, what I think you're linking at here is that wildlife crimes don't occur in isolation. They're often accompanied by other crimes involving people. So what we'll be looking at here are assaults, trespassing, etc. Abalone, I need to take a look at the TOPS list. If I recall correctly, they are a species that is included in the TOPS list, so they are nationally protected. If they're not included in the TOPS list itself, they're definitely included in our Marine Living Resources Act. And the enforcement agency that's responsible for looking at that directly are fisheries officials. Again, like the forestry officials that we spoke of earlier, they are based, previously they used to be based with the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. That unit is about to move across to the Department of Environment now that the scope of the environmental department's been extended to fisheries and forestry. We are hoping that that move will allow additional resources to be focused at abalone crimes. It's one of the most severe wildlife crimes that we've got in South Africa. And it's having absolutely devastating impacts. I'm in regular contact with the fisheries officials, specifically in the Western Cape. And they've told me recently that while there is legal trade in it and we are farming abalone, what generally happens, I'm not sure if my video is on, is that abalone would be approximately the size of my palm or my whole hand when it's harvested legally. What they're finding in these seizures is it's the size of the last digit of my pinky finger. So our abalone stocks are being absolutely decimated. And I think you've touched on a very important wildlife crime. And maybe a very important message that I tried to relay earlier is that wildlife crimes are not just about charismatic species. And oftentimes the abalone and the cycad and the little lizard, where those elements are removed, is incredibly devastating to our wildlife, and they sometimes fall on the wayside. So thank you very much for focusing on abalone. Eleanor has asked, does the problem of corruption crop up in this area? Unfortunately, yes. Corruption, I think it steeps into every aspect with all crimes. From my experience though, I've been very, very blessed to work closely with law enforcement officials. So I've seen maybe behind the curtain a little bit, I've seen the amazing dedication of enforcement officials in South Africa and the police, and how dedicated they are to combating it. So while corruption is a problem, and it's a problem that we all face in South Africa, I would like to highlight the amazing work that men and women are doing in South Africa to combat wildlife crimes. And then Andreas has asked, there's a complete lack of understanding or training of the policing authorities and a lack of political will to act. We had an instance where we caught a poacher red-handed 6 months ago who killed a pregnant mountain reedbuck in our area and found it impossible to prosecute, even with a representative of the green scorpions present. And Andreas, what you've touched on here is exactly why we're looking at private prosecution. It's for these kind of cases where there should have been justice and there wasn't. In terms of the training, I can't speak for all organizations. I can speak for the Endangered Wildlife Trust, specifically the Wildlife and Trade Program, where we've developed extensive wildlife trade training across various different topics. And the follow-up that we've had from that has been fantastic. I mentioned earlier in the presentation about Cycads. We've created a dedicated Cycad training course. And just one of the enforcement officials, the year after attending that course, was responsible for removing over 350 illegal Cycads from trade and commercial operations. So while I understand your frustrations, and it's something that we have to continuously work at, this is why we are exploring novel and different approaches. I mentioned that wildlife crimes are a wicked problem. We need to be dynamic in our approach to address them. I would ask you to please contact me directly about this. I would like to work with you to explore other avenues here. 2 more questions have come through from Rosemary. Developers flatten ground and cut trees down prior to any application process. Often hedgehogs are never removed but flattened, oh shame, or entombed in the ground. Is it not possible to enforce a pre-preparation of future developments on land? So Rosemary, what you've touched on here, oh, sorry, that question has now disappeared, but maybe just to address it. Development, there's various activities. So when we talk about different lists, there's also a list of developmental activities included in the regulations attached to NEMA that require the pre-approval of what we call an environmental authorization before development can take place. And one of those listed activities is virgin grassland. So there should have been an environmental impact assessment undertaken before that development, and an environmental authorization should have been issued. And if you don't undertake those, you've committed a different kind of environmental offence. It's what we typically class as a brown offence. It's illegal development. Miranda has asked, how do people keep themselves safe when reporting cases? Can they report them anonymously? You can. People have reported them anonymously to me before. It does make it difficult for law enforcement to follow up though. So it would depend on the facts of the case. You can report it to me and ask that you be kept anonymous, in which case I'll do that. You can report it anonymously on the DA hotline. But there might be some follow-up that is required. So I think it would depend on the facts of the case as to how it's conducted and what level of protection is afforded to you. Eleanor has asked, what happens to the cycads that are removed from illegal trade? Are they returned to the area where they're found, or what? So Eleanor, this depends on the facts of the case. There are some instances where they are repopulated, but it depends on how damaged the cycads are. The challenge that we find with cycad trade, or the illegal cycad trade, is that cycads are a slow growing species, and people want big cycads in their gardens. And when these are illegally harvested or poached, to use the colloquial term, they're often very damaged. So the stem will be damaged to the point where the cycad dies in a couple of years. So it depends on the facts of the situation and how long the court case takes. I've been to provincial offices where they've got stacks of cycads in the back of the gardens where they've kind of planted, and they've got them in pots waiting for a court case to be finalized and waiting for the cycads to grow their leaves out before they are replanted. So every effort is undertaken, but it does depend on the facts of the case. So we've got to the end of the questions. I don't know if anybody would like to ask any follow-ups. But just a reminder to specifically the people that I've mentioned, but anybody who would like to email me directly to please do so. But there are a specific number of cases where I'd like to provide a little bit more information based on the specific instances that you've raised. Thank you. I see some thank yous are coming through. So I think we probably have reached the end of our Q&A section. But Marion, thank you very much for that.